This was how she announced her decision today.
We make decisions about what's best for ourselves, our family, and our community. And so we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, is this a Republican idea or is this a Democratic idea? Is this liberal or is this conservative? That's not how Arizonans think. Registering as an independent and showing up to work with the title of independent is a reflection of who I've always been. And it's a reflection of who Arizona is.
Senator Kyrsten Sinema announced today that she would leave the Democratic Party to become an independent and said that she's doing so because that's what Arizona voters want. The senator elaborated on her decision in an op-ed for azcentral.com. Quote, "Pressures in both parties pull leaders to the edges, allowing the loudest, most extreme voices to determine their respective parties' priorities. In catering to the fringes, neither party has demonstrated much tolerance for diversity of thought. Americans are told we only have two choices, Democrat or Republican, and that we must subscribe wholesale to policy views the parties hold, views that have been pulled farther and farther toward the extremes. Most Arizonans believe this is a false choice." Anyone who is not just waking up from a 12-year coma knows that what the senator is engaging in here is false equivalency. A study this year by the Pew Research Center found that since 1972, the Republican Party has become more than 4 times more polarized than the Democratic Party in the Senate and more than 3 times more polarized in the House. We are way past the point where any reasonable person can look at a GOP that is given in to anti-democratic right-wing demagoguery and a Democratic Party where some people want everyone to have free health care and declare that extremism has captured both sides. But set that aside for a second, because Senator Sinema isn't just wrong about America. She is wrong about Arizona. The biggest political earthquake of the last 3 elections has been the shift we've watched in Georgia and Arizona. Both states have gone from Republican strongholds to states where Democrats can win statewide. And that shift wasn't driven by a radical rise in moderate swing voters. Both Georgia and Arizona have seen rapid growth in their urban populations alongside a steady decline in the rural population. The Atlanta area is now one of the fastest growing major metro areas in the U.S., driven in part by a diverse influx of residents who recently helped turn Atlanta into a majority non-white city. At the same time, rural parts of Georgia, like Dooley County, have lost as much as a quarter of their population. Phoenix, Arizona recently surpassed Philadelphia to become the nation's 5th largest city, while Cochise County, home of some of the state's most ardent election deniers, was one of the few places in Arizona that lost residents over the past decade. Those shifts have moved the political center of gravity away from largely white rural conservative areas toward multi-ethnic Democratic-leaning cities and suburbs. Organizers in those places spent years building power to mobilize those Democratic-leaning urban constituencies to vote in big enough numbers that they can overcome rural conservative majorities. In other words, a trend in those states, including Arizona, isn't moving away from both parties. It's moving toward Democrats. And the evidence is right there in the last election. Just this week, Senator Raphael Warnock won his 2nd Senate election in 2 years, running as a party-line Democrat in Georgia. Senator Mark Kelly also won his second Senate election in 2 years, also running on his record as a rank-and-file Democrat in the Senate. Democrats in Arizona won statewide races for Senate, for governor, for Secretary of State, all in a year that should have favored Republicans in a very recently red state. But Senator Sinema has somehow decided that the lesson of all that, the lesson of that election, is that Arizona voters don't want to vote for someone associated with the Democratic Party. Now, it's worth pointing out that what Senator Sinema is doing here will not fundamentally change the balance of power in Washington. She says she won't caucus with Republicans, which means Democrats will retain their outright majority, keeping their power over Senate committees and the Senate floor. But what Senator Sinema is doing here will change the balance of power in Arizona's next Senate election. And that is really what's important here. That is what this is all about. For context, it's worth understanding just how unpopular Kyrsten Sinema is with Democratic voters in her state. A poll taken this past January, just as Senators Sinema and Manchin were throwing a wrench in President Biden's agenda, found that only 19% of Democratic primary voters in Arizona approved of the job Senator Sinema was doing. By contrast, Senator Mark Kelly had an 83% approval rating among those same Arizona Democrats. President Biden was at 80%. That same poll found Senator Sinema would lose a hypothetical primary race to Arizona Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego by a whopping, staggering 58 points. 58! Senator Sinema is likely more unpopular with voters in her own party than any Democratic senator has been in decades. And that is the real reason Senator Sinema left the Democratic Party today. By changing her affiliation to independent, Sinema is ensuring that she won't have to face a primary challenger and that any Arizona Democrat who wants to challenge her will have to do so in a three-way race that could risk splitting the Democratic vote and handing that race to a Republican. For the past 2 years, Democrats and the Biden administration have watched their agenda be stymied by moderates like Senators Sinema and Manchin. Now one of those senators is maneuvering to ensure that one of the seats key to any Democratic majority in the Senate will remain in the hands of a moderate obstructionist, someone who will oppose any of the changes necessary to ensure things like voting rights and abortion access. So what do progressives and Arizona Democrats, what do they do now?